1927-1928 program of destroyers for the Royal Navy would derive from the lessons the Royal Navy had learned from the First World War in two experimental destroyers, HMS Amazon and HMS Ambuscade. The A-Class would start a trend for interwar British destroyers, not only with their armament but with the naming conventions and how destroyer flotillas would be built, having 8 built in the class for the Royal Navy and a flotilla leader. Now, these flotilla leaders would usually be a bit larger, carrying an extra 4.7-inch gun, meaning that they would have 5 instead of 4, and some extra accommodations to fit the needs of a flotilla leader. Through Admiralty committees and trials with weaponry, notably the testing of the 4.7-inch gun, they would determine that these future interwar destroyer designs, and like I mentioned, they would be tested through Amazon and Ambuscade, which would differ from the later A through I classes with their funnels of an equal width. Even though they would have 3 boilers, later destroyers would adopt funnels of equal width, not to mention the numerous destroyers built for foreign navies that would see similar armaments and designs as the later A through I classes. The first thing that would be discussed would be the endurance of the new class of destroyers, as it would set the ship's displacement. In a meeting on July 6, 1926, the Director of Plans would request 2,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, with the ability for the ship to be at 18 knots, and for the ship to be at 2/3 top speed for 24 hours. At a further meeting in August, it was pointed out that Ambuscade would need an additional 200 tons of fuel to satisfy this request. Meanwhile, the ship would displace 2,200 tons rather than 1,600 tons, meaning she would be no longer accepted as a destroyer. Ambuscade could actually do 1,500 nautical miles at 16 knots, plus 12 hours at 2/3 speed. These figures would reflect the feeling of the Royal Navy at the time, feeling that the Japanese Imperial Navy would be a chief opponent, as the island nation would covet the British holdings in the Far East. Those figures reflected the needs of a fleet moving from Singapore to fight the Japanese fleet in the Pacific, and to allow for 12 hours of combat time. So, by March of 1927, the planned fuel capacity of the future A-class would be reduced from 400 tons to 350 tons. There would be questions as to how endurance should be calculated, as the usual method was to use trial figures for horsepower at endurance speed, together with the measured fuel consumption per mile at that speed. But they were not useful for staff purposes, as they were somewhat unrealistic. As for the new destroyers of the A-class, the Director of Naval Construction would use figures from the trial, tons per hour and pounds per shaft horsepower per hour. Endurance for the lead ship of the A-class, HMS Acosta, would sit around 3,570 nautical miles at 15 knots. This would be more than the 2,000 nautical mile range the Director of Plans wanted, but less than the 5,000 nautical mile range, an earlier requirement to escort the fleet from Trincomalee to Singapore. Moving into some of the armaments here with the torpedo armament, as those aforementioned Admiralty meetings set out, the destroyers would be primarily seen as fleet torpedo boats, so they would have 2 quadruple 21-inch torpedo launchers, which were recently developed for the cruisers HMS Emerald and Enterprise. A quintuple torpedo launcher was in development, and which it was hoped would weigh less than a quadruple tube including torpedoes, but it would not be ready for destroyers until the 1930s, which was discussed in a video in the G and H classes of destroyers. As Amazon and Ambuscade would show, the A-class would carry 4 single 4.7-inch guns. There would be plans to put them in mounts that would be able to elevate to 40 degrees, and B-turret was hoped to elevate to 60 degrees for more anti-aircraft fire support. But the elevation was reduced back to 30 degrees, but the requirement for the high-angle gun would be kept, but due to issues with the fire control systems and rangefinders, every gun would have elevations of 30 degrees. Now, it was assumed all the way through 1927 the destroyers would have sophisticated fire control systems, including below-deck computers, but instead, they would have the same fire control arrangements as the previous W-class, with nothing more than a Vickers clock below deck. Another interesting thing is that all the destroyers would be built so that they could be fitted with ASDIC, but not all of these ships would have ASDIC installed. Now, let's discuss the ship's design. They would displace around 1,350 tons standard displacement, having 3 boilers that powered 2 geared turbines that turned 2 shafts, giving the ship around 34,000 shaft horsepower, and a top speed of about 35 knots. The ships would carry 4 single 4.7-inch or 120mm guns in single mounts, and 2 super firing forward and 2 aft, along with carrying 2 quadruple torpedo tubes aft of the funnel, along with a light anti-aircraft battery that would be improved during wartime. They would also carry an arrangement of depth charges, with 3 depth charge chutes but no throwers initially. Another important part of the ship would be their lack of mine-laying gear and the addition of mine-sweeping equipment. They would be laid down between 1928 and 1929, with them being complete between 1930 and 1931. The destroyer leader for this group, HMS Cornington, would be the flotilla leader for the A-class of destroyers, and would differ as I previously mentioned. I should mention here that a couple of destroyers would be built for the Royal Canadian Navy and would differ from the other ships of the class. Now, the A-class would follow a naming convention where the destroyers of the class would all have names starting with the letter A, with ships like HMS Acosta, Acades, Active, Antelope, Anthony, Ardent, Arrow, and Acheron. In the following B-class of destroyers, which would be modified versions of the A-class, they would follow a similar naming convention with ships like HMS Bulldog and Brilliant. Some notable additions to the B-class would be the Aztec installed, which was effectively the first British production installation, along with more experimentation with high-angle gun mounts, along with some more differences, but still the classes would be very similar to each other. In the interwar period, some of the ships would see service and neutrality patrols off the Spanish coast while the Spanish Civil War was going on, as part of the Mediterranean fleet as the A-class with the flotilla leader was stationed there. Along with some of the other destroyers that we have discussed on this channel, they would be recalled to the United Kingdom shortly after war breaking out. For the most part, the destroyers would be involved in convoy escorting duties, along with anti-submarine patrols in the North Atlantic and home waters, not to mention escorting capital ships. Out of the 11 ships built in the A-class, including the 2 Canadian ships and the flotilla leader HMS Cordington, 7 would be sunk. HMS Acosta and Ardent would be sunk near Narvik while escorting the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, as they were trying to defend her from the German battleship Scharnhorst in Gneisenau. Cordington would be sunk at Dover in July of 1940, but the ships would see service all along the European theater of war, and those that survived the war would be scrapped and broken up afterwards. British destroyer development is really an interesting topic, and I highly recommend you all pick up Norman Freeman's British Destroyers from Earliest Days to the Second World War, as helped me with a lot of these British destroyer videos and provided a lot of good information, but certainly is not a read that would get your heart rate elevated with suspense. Nevertheless, I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and please remember to like and subscribe, as it helps the channel to grow.